Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Political Tools and Beyond the Headlines. Last week's decisions by the US Supreme Court were not unexpected, but they're momentous nevertheless. Trump's three nominations to the court are having a major impact, setting women's rights back by more than 50 years. We're here to ask what will be the impact on the polls. So have the Economists Washington, D.C. correspondent with us, Idrees Kahloon, to look ahead at the US midterms. Hello and welcome, Idrees.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much.
Great to have you with us. You're in San Francisco, where it's unbelievably early in the morning, 6 o'clock. So very grateful for you to be getting up this early. And I think we'll have a few Australians online too, where it's late in the evening. First of all, can you just give us a very quick recap? The court's decision on abortion wasn't unexpected, but you expect to see repercussions across various states immediately. What's going to happen over the next few months?
Well, what you're going to see because of the court's decision is a bifurcation of the abortion regime within states. So to recap, Roe versus Wade said that there was embedded within the Constitution a fundamental right to abortion. And that meant that in every state, a woman had to have the right, regardless of the majority opinion in that state. What the court has done now is said that actually there was no such right, and that in Alito's words, Roe was egregiously wrong from the start, and that the Constitution has nothing really to say about abortion restrictions in states. And what that means is that in 16 states right now, mostly democratically led, the ability to access abortion is going to look very similar to what it did before. In about 13 states, however, there are trigger laws that went into effect that mean that abortion is either illegal presently or is soon to be fairly illegal soon. So that sets the stakes for what's to happen in the immediate future. But we now, I think, will not see an end to the legal warring. There are going to be efforts to suppress the movement of abortion medication, which is often used now in the first trimester. States that want to be restrictive will look at that. And there are also debates about whether or not it is permissible for a state to try to prevent women from leaving states in order to obtain an abortion. So we're going to see, I think, continued legal warring over this stuff. The Department of Justice has said it's going to get involved, but state legislators have proven to be quite crafty, even when Roe was in place, in terms of making it harder and harder to access abortion. And I don't think that this has ended the war. It's just started a new sort of battle for it.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's quite startling. And I can't help, we have an audience around the world, and we've got people, we travel to places like Iran. There are lots of places we've been to around the world that seem to have a more liberal view about abortion, surprisingly, than the US currently does.
Yeah, that's very much right. I mean, within the Islamic tradition, for example, there's this idea that abortion is permissible before the fetus is ensouled, is the term. So, and within the Jewish faith as well, there's some amount of tolerance for abortion. So, there is the sort of sentiment against abortion in America is very much tied to the growth of the evangelical movement, which is itself tied to, the sort of nascent Christian nationalism within the Republican Party. All three of those have combined in this way. But one thing that we'll see is, in some cases, so one thing I was looking at was comparing in my home state of Kentucky, presently a woman cannot obtain an abortion basically under any circumstances other than threat to her life, and that includes rape or incest. And there aren't exceptions for the health of the mother, short of death, which is actually a more severe restriction than is presently in the place in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. In both of those countries, which are not really that permissive to abortion, there's a feeling that if carrying a baby to term would harm the mother's health, abortion is still permissible. But that's not the case presently in states like Kentucky and Arkansas. And conversely, it's worth mentioning that much of Western Europe has standards of or limits that are well below the thresholds that some of the democratic states have set up for themselves. So Sweden, for example, I believe has a threshold of 18 weeks. France, 15 weeks, by the way, is the amount that Mississippi was trying to enact in the case that eventually triggered the end of Roe. So in a lot of ways, America looks like, as it does in so many other things, to quite extremely different countries inhabiting what's supposed to be the same republic.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. I'm tempted to go down the route of looking at how the court favors the states over the federal government in this area, saying there's no right to it, and obviously then saying that there's a right to bear arms, for example. But I think that's possibly a debate for another day, because we've got. What I want to try and do is look at how this is going to play out politically. I think possibly the obvious thing to say is that President Biden is in a pretty awful position. His polling is worse than Trump was for part of his presidency, which is quite incredible to say. And it doesn't look like, if you look on the sort of horizon in terms of the economy, things are not looking good. So are the Democrats hoping that this decision might rally their base a bit? I mean, there seems to be a lot of ads going out and evidence that they think so.
They certainly think so. And it's interesting. Democrats are trying to talk about this as much as they can, and Republicans are trying very hard not to talk about it and to talk about inflation and the economy, which I think is an indicator of what they think the political advantage will be. But in terms of what this actually changes, political scientists have for a long time noticed that the main thing that determines, or you can predict with quite a lot of accuracy, the direction of the midterms based on the president's approval rating and perceptions of the economy. And both of those are really bad for Democrats right now. There have only been two midterm elections, basically in modern American political history, in which the president's party has gained votes. One of those was 1998, after Bill Clinton was unsuccessfully impeached. And the second was 2002, shortly after 9/11, both fairly extraordinary circumstances. So it's very likely that Democrats are going to lose significantly based on the present approval ratings and the like, probably lose control of the House. And, while abortion might decrease the margin of that loss, I don't think it'll be enough to reverse that. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that in a lot of states, abortion restrictions are popular. They command a majority of the vote. So it's going to be tougher to actually enact a sort of electoral change there. There are some states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin that are more swing states, where the population is in favor of keeping the old standard of Roe. But the Republicans who are running for office are quite doctrinaire in their opposition to abortion. And for example, the governor of Pennsylvania, the senator who's running for Pennsylvania, the governor of Michigan. And in those races, it might make some difference. Now, it won't make a difference in the sense of swinging voters all that much. Abortion has become such a polarizing issue that there aren't that many pro-life Democrats, and there aren't that many pro-choice Republicans. There are a few, but will that be enough to surmount their sort of partisan identity? I think less so. Where this will matter.
Just to pick you up on that, I mean, basically what you're saying is that so many Republicans might disagree with what the court has decided, but not enough to swing the vote.
Yeah. The effect will be marginal, and in states where margins are quite close, marginal things can add up, so they're not trivial. But if you consider, the political scientists have this theory for why Americans vote the way they do, and how they explain the growth of partisanship and polarization. And they have this theory called negative partisanship, which is this idea that for whatever the sins of my own side, the other guys are so terrible that I cannot fathom voting for them in any way. And so for the political psychology of a Republican voter, most Americans, first of all, are moderate on this issue. Most Americans want abortion to be present, but they want restrictions on the time in which a mother can do it that are more restrictive than what Roe was. So putting that aside, but for a Republican who is disquieted by the possibility of severe restrictions, they will also have to think, they will also have to surmount their association of Democrats with things like socialism and critical race theory, these sorts of things, inflation, these sorts of things.
Does the same go for gun rights as well?
I think so. You can do a very similar analysis there, right? You see the people who are most exercised about this issue, as with abortion, have already sorted into their respective parties. If you are an ardent Second Amendment enthusiast, you probably are already voting Republican, and the gun control bill or the Supreme Court decision doesn't really change your vote. Similarly, if you're a Democratic activist that's going out to protest, I mean, your vote's already counted for. Mass mobilizations can make a difference, but they're a bit, they're a bit harder than we might think. And they'll matter in states where the margins are kind of close, right? You're not going to flip North Dakota or South Dakota on these issues. But you might make inroads in a state like Pennsylvania. And I know one thing we want to talk about is Georgia a bit later, but I think that Stacey Abrams is actually the underdog in that contest, and something like the abortion decision and gun rights might boost her chances a bit.
We'll come to that in just a second. So we're talking about Stacey Abrams, who's the Democratic contender for the governorship in Georgia, but we'll come to that in just a second. The other decision we heard from the Supreme Court was about gun rights, saying that essentially striking down a law by New York State to allow people which was restricting or asking for more licensing and restrictions on people having concealed carry. So that struck down a New York law. At the same time, the Senate and Congress have passed new legislation that will require more restrictions, more checks on some people acquiring guns. So two things pitted against each other here. I think my overall point was that these both on abortion and on the gun rights issue, but also we've seen the latest school massacre. You think and expect that there might be some sort of direct political consequence from that, the polls, and you're saying it's very limited on both counts. That was the key point.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, there have been quite a lot of mass shootings in America, many of them very horrific. And the sort of political consequences of those have all frequently washed out. You can point to isolated cases, sometimes within state law, where, for example, after the shooting in Parkland, Florida enacted more checks on guns for its own state. You can point to some points like that, but I've also seen research that suggests that in conservative states, these sort of mass shootings trigger looser gun laws at the same time. Oftentimes we're focused on the places where restrictions are going up, but this paper made the point that in some states, actually, they seem to trigger a reflexive, reaction. So, unfortunately, I think that's been the case for a few decades.
The undertone to all these stories is that the march of the Republican right, can track from Newt Gingrich to Trump and becoming more and more hardline. And you mentioned Georgia. And the thing that I picked up on that race there, it seemed to me that on both sides, both Republicans and the Democrats are actually competing for the center ground there, which seemed to be going against the sort of the national sort of narrative, if you like. Am I right in thinking that? And can you talk a bit more about some of the races we were speaking about?
Stacey Abrams is certainly running as a moderate Democrat. She's not running like the progressive icon that she's sort of become. The things that she...
Just remind us for who Stacey Abrams is. She was a pivotal person in the 2020 election, seemed to have corralled the Black American vote in Georgia and got Biden across the line?
Yeah. So Stacey Abrams ran for governor of Georgia in 2018, and she came very close to winning. She very narrowly lost to Brian Kemp. And the way that she achieved that result was by an aggressive voter turnout campaign that had begun many years before, when she was Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives. And the theory was that by turning out African American, Hispanic voters, that she would turn Georgia blue. She didn't succeed in 2018, and she claimed that Brian Kemp, who was then the Secretary of State in charge of the elections, had engaged in voter suppression, and that was why she lost. And because of that, she became quite popular nationally. In 2020, Georgia did turn blue, both for Biden in the Electoral College, but also it sent 2 Democratic senators to Congress, thereby giving Democrats a 50-50 majority and enabling them to pass legislation that they probably would not have. She's running again to be governor in 2022, again against Brian Kemp, who is now, previously he ran as a really, really solid Republican, but he's now a bit of a persona non grata among the Trumpier factions, because he did not help Trump steal the election, which is what he wanted him to do in Georgia. So given that backdrop, and given Abrams's sort of national profile, the fact that she's, on Star Trek and SNL and everything else, you might think that she's running a sort of AOC style, Medicare for all kind of campaign, but she's very much not. I mean, her signature issue, it seems, is Medicaid expansion, which is, status intervention, but it's one that's fairly popular. And she just released a plan last week, arguing that the salaries of police should be increased. So she's very much distancing herself from defund the police types. I think Kemp will tack a bit to the center, but his nature is not.
Just stop you there. I mean, because the point is, you expect Trump has been going around giving endorsements, across the states, and in Georgia, both his candidates, if you're talking about for 2 of his candidates, one for governor, we're talking about Kemp, and then Raffensperger as state secretary, were not his. He was against them, and they both got in.
Yeah. And I went and covered that and got to speak to Raffensperger about his campaign.
I should say nominations, the Republican candidate.
Yeah, the primary. They both survived their primary challenge. So did the attorney general, who was a sort of minor figure. But basically, Trump has actually, I think last I checked, his track record for endorsements in the primaries this cycle has been about 73% or something, fairly high. And if you look at the way that candidates are positioning themselves in important primaries like the Ohio Senate race or the Pennsylvania Senate race or the Arizona Senate race, they are all acting like Trump is the kingmaker, and they are all trying to position themselves in such a way that Trump might endorse them, so it matters to them. But I think what happened in Georgia was that Trump's personal animus for Kemp and Brad Raffensperger meant that he basically tried to stir up candidates, and he found people who were, I think, less convincing. And Trump has actually been fairly disciplined in picking people he thinks will win. So I think he knows that, people are going to examine how well his candidates do as a sign of how much control over the party he has. But, in Georgia, he picked David Perdue, who was the senator who lost. And Perdue had to undergo this reinvention from, kind of conservative run-of-the-mill businessman into ultra MAGA. Kemp didn't help the president. Democrats stole the election. Backwards looking 2020 campaign. And the candidate he stirred up against, Raffensperger, a representative named Jody Heiss, was in this similar vein, who also I think Heiss had a better chance of winning, but from what I can gather, his campaign was quite lackluster, and Raffensperger spent quite a lot of time, about a year, traveling Georgia and trying to get back into their good graces. But even if you look at both men's actual campaigns, both men are not emphasizing the fact that Donald Trump tried to steal the Georgia election and that they held firm and held to their oath of office over the party. That's a side point. That's not one that they want to dwell very much on. Mm-hmm. If you ask them about it, they'll talk about it and they'll defend their actions. But they know that becoming a sort of Liz Cheney-like figure, being a sort of Saint Sebastian with the arrows slung at you, is not going to get them elected, so they don't emphasize it, and that itself, I think, is an indication of where the direction of the party is. One thing, I don't know if any of you watched the January 6th committee hearings that were happening last week. They got completely overshadowed by the abortion decision for obvious reasons, but one of the people who testified quite powerfully was, in addition to Raffensperger, Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, a Republican named Rusty Bowers, who talked quite eloquently about how his faith and his oath of office meant that he had no choice but to resist the significant pressure that people like Rudy Giuliani were placing on him to decertify the Arizona election results. And he was quite impactful. But in an interview that he gave right before the testimony, he said that nonetheless, if Trump were the nominee in 2024, I would still vote for him, which is, I think, it goes back to illustrate the point I was making about negative partisanship, the idea that however anti-democratic and personally hostile I've known this man to be. I mean, Bowers talks a bit about the fact that Stop the Steal protesters were outside of his house around the time that his daughter was dying, and some of the last things she heard were people calling him a pedophile and these sorts of horrible things. Nonetheless, if he's going to vote for him, because the other party is so awful, I think that's a grim microcosm for what's wrong with American politics.
Is that to say that those hearings, the January 6th hearings, really aren't going to have much impact on the electorate either? What do you think significant that has come out of them? I mean, you've talked about that's one example, and you're talking about him voting for Trump still, but are there any other things conclusions you think that have come out of it?
Yeah, I feel like a slightly bad journalist because journalists are supposed to say that everything matters and it might be existential, but I feel like I've been saying, it's better to expect that effects are minimal. But I think that the January 6th hearings have gone better than I thought in terms of their impact and in terms of their structure. One thing that was interesting was I was reading a New York Times piece about the fact that they actually are receiving assistance from a television executive producer in terms of laying out their sort of episodes and graphics and these sorts of things.
The hearings are the people who organize the hearings.
Yeah, and that makes sense. My feeling previously was that these wouldn't have very much of an impact, partially because we've seen these sorts of attempts before. We've seen with both impeachments this idea that Democrats have that if they just had an organized, forensic accounting of Donald Trump's actions, Republicans would be shamed into realizing that this man was not fit for the presidency. And in both those cases, the wishful thinking, I think, very quickly hit reality. So, third time I thought would not be the charm. We have largely covered terrain that most people who were, around for January 6th will be familiar with. We've gotten added color and texture. We see the extent of the pressure campaign that was launched. We see the extent of the pressure that was put on Vice President Pence, in particular, the fact that the Department of Justice was nearly in the hands of a man who was not at all competent, but whose only criteria was being a sort of complete Trump toady. All these things we see, and they're sort of newly fascinating. But I wonder what the effect will be on the Republican electorate. 70% of them still say that Joe Biden stole the election. That's been consistent ever since election day.
Mm.
So if anything can break through, I think it might be something like this. But the bind between Trump and the party has been so tight that it's probably a safer bet to say that it won't change.
Yeah, I think your colleagues have said that things are bad now for Biden. They're only going to get worse.
Yeah.
From COVID, now to inflation, and a sort of economic slowdown, if not recession, expected sooner or later. A Republican held House might try and impeach him. Why not? And they've got the power to do so. And he's visibly started to slow down. They say that he's got a reasonable grip on policy, but still looks pretty slow in public. So my first question is, how do you assess his White House? How are they done so far? What's your assessment of
them? Well, they've done much less than they set out to do. They had these grand ambitions for how they would remake America, that Biden would be a New Deal sort of president with Rooseveltian sort of accomplishments to his name. And in part because of how high they've set expectations, they've, I think, failed relative to them. That doesn't mean that things haven't happened, but we certainly don't have anything like the New Deal, like any of the sort of great society programs that Johnson wanted to implement. What we have legislatively is, in the first sort of big one was the American Rescue Plan, which was this $1.9 trillion stimulus plan that went into effect shortly after Biden became president. And, that was a lot of money. It's been spent. It probably heightened inflation to some degree. And it did not create a permanent structure that altered America. A lot of it was the sugar rush of stimulus checks or state aid or these sorts of things, money that, kind of goes into salaries and disappears. Nothing like Obamacare. There haven't been, and then everything else got wrapped up into Build Back Better, which was going to be this climate change spending bill with safety net spending. It was going to increase taxes on companies and the wealthy. And because the Biden administration put all of its eggs in one basket effectively, when that collapsed, and it hasn't really restarted yet, it looked as though the administration has failed. There's some exceptions, obviously. They passed an infrastructure bill, which is actually fairly large. They passed this gun control bill. They are getting close to a deal on a U.S.-China competition bill. These things are reasonably good accomplishments for a president, but because they've been messaging essentially to say Republicans need to pass Build Back Better, or Democrats need to pass it, that's the only thing that'll fix everything. And the fact that it's failed, I think, has shown their accomplishments in actually a harsher light than they might have intended.
Okay. Looking ahead now to 2024, we've just been traveling around Europe. We've been had contact with people in France involved with foreign affairs there. We've been through the Baltics, been in Finland, and the big concern there is if there's another Trump presidency and what that does for sort of transatlantic relations and really the strength of democracy in the world. That's an obvious worry. So you've got to look at the Democrats and also the Republicans as what they might provide as an alternative. And within the Democratic camp, it's a problem, isn't it? If Biden seen as running again, he's clearly perceived as being too old. And then his vice is also not seen as terribly strong. Can you just tell me about why is Kamala Harris not seen as a good prospect within the Democratic Party?
Well, Democrats have seen this movie before of a underwhelming candidate basically achieving the nomination by coronation, effectively, with Hillary Clinton. And they saw the consequences of that, which was Trump winning, and the American sort of Trumpian nightmare continuing from there.
So how do you think that plays out then?
If for the nomination?
Yeah. What's the competition? I guess first of all, you've got to persuade the president that he's not running, then the vice president that possibly she should put in a bid but compete with others, and then who comes in?
So assuming you get through those two hurdles, which I'm not sure that you necessarily will, the bench has a couple of other old timers. Bernie's still around. Elizabeth Warren is slightly younger, and probably might have one more campaign run within her. But if you look towards the sort of next generation of Democrats who could run, I think that there are certainly people like Pete Buttigieg who are clearly ambitious people who will want to run. There are folks like Ro Khanna, who is a progressive representative in the House, who are contemplating this stuff. I mean, you could even see a run from someone like AOC. But if you think about when did we know about Pete Buttigieg, when did we know about someone named Barack Obama? These kinds of people kind of leap onto the public imagination in the 2 or so years before an election. So there's certainly those people who would run. Cory Booker will probably run again if he can, but I think there will also be one or two folks who we haven't heard of who will suddenly. I mean, there's going to be an Andrew Yang of some kind.
We run a Iowa caucuses tour, which is always. For your access to candidates and seeing the race on both sides is actually amazing, and sort of being in the room with those candidates. Let's get some questions in, please, people. If you can put your questions in the Q&A box, we can put them to Idrees. So get tapping away. There's tons to ask about, and you normally don't hold back, so don't hold back now. What's Mike Pence doing?
Is that a question from you or from?
Yeah, no, for you. That's a question for you.
Oh, okay. He's thinking about running, I think. He certainly is acting like it. I think he has some political action committee or some, one of these political jobs that people do in holding while they wait to run. Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, also has one of these outfits where they tour the country, go to swing states, make endorsements, make speeches, try to stay in the public eye. So I think he's trying to see whether or not there's an avenue for him. And I think that if Donald Trump were to want to run again, it would be very hard for anyone to make space. I think certainly true for Pence. I think there's been a recent amount of optimism that Ron DeSantis could displace Donald Trump in a Republican nomination, but I'm a bit more skeptical of that actually happening at this moment.
Right, it's an amazing prospect. We've got some questions coming in. I'm hoping that we can bring Richard Murphy online. He's got a question there. Can we bring Richard up? Yeah, there we go. Richard, far away.
Hi, yeah, I think this is the question about democratic activists rather than voters, and how much they might be motivated. And for Nicholas, I'd thrown in, I'm a Lib Democrat activist in the UK. 5 of us were campaigning down at the by-election that we've just had, where Boris Johnson was defeated effectively. And we had all were motivated by Brexit to join and become activists, but have now broadened that out to actually just campaign against the government.
So what's the question on?
So will it motivate activists? Because in the end, a lot will depend on who just physically knocking on doors, living leaflets, collecting money. That's
I'm going to push back at you. I'm going to push back at you, Richard. I think Britons are politically largely apathetic, and and Brexit got some people engaged, but I think the Americans had plenty of activists left and right for a very long period of time. Idrees, do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think you could argue that perhaps political activists in America are slightly too active, and that is part of the problem. But no, I don't think that there's ever any shortage of volunteers for these sorts of campaigns, for presidential campaigns, certainly, even congressional campaigns, these sorts of things. There's an incredible amount of money that is spent on elections. I mean, I think the last one was 10 billion, 11 billion. That's people knocking on doors, but it's also this deluge of advertising that you see on TV and on the internet, which if you've been in America for an election year, you really know it. And it's quite distinctive from Europe in that way. So I think that there won't be a sort of dearth of activism. What will matter is whether or not that actually can lead into votes. While America is interesting because there's a significant number of people who read the news, people who can name probably all 9 Supreme Court justices off the top of their head. And the vast majority of Americans can't. And in midterms, it's tough to actually drive turnout. So while there are quite a lot of activists within America, giving people a motivational message that will actually drive them to the polls is a separate thing. So I'd point that out.
Right.
So
okay.
It's just not. You were saying there isn't the same scope as there is in the UK to actually boost the physical activism side.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's the determinant of election results broadly, because there are just so many people you have to convince to vote, and the things that their vote turn on are very different from what motivates people to go out and volunteer.
But it would seem to me that the die is substantially cast in the States in the way that it isn't here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's turn to Simon Jackson, and it could be Annie McMahon. I can't tell with the beard.
Very hard to tell.
Yeah.
I remember as a child learning that the judiciary is above politics and exists in part to protect the people from the excesses of politicians. To what extent does the American public still believe this to be the case? Because they do seem to act increasingly like an unelected chamber.
Can I add one more question to that? Obviously, there's been a trajectory where the Supreme Court's got more and more, not talking about the Supreme Court, it's got more and more political. And there must be a lot written about that. And I'm actually interested if there's any particular book or reading that one could look to as well.
Yeah. I think that the Supreme Court has gone through cycles of this sort of sentiment. When these decisions, the ones that we're talking about, particularly for Roe was seen as quite an activist decision when it was made in the 1970s, to basically say that there was a fundamental right to abortion within the Constitution that didn't exist before. So I think to some extent this, and previously the court that FDR was dealing with was seen as quite conservative and too conservative. So I think that there are cycles to the sentiment, and what always happens is people who don't like a decision start to question the legitimacy of the court. People who do like the decision say the court is fulfilling its actual purpose. You saw that with in 2010 when the court decided that Obamacare was constitutional. You saw conservatives say kind of the similar thing to what liberals are saying today. But stepping back, America does have quite a strange constitutional order. Britain does have a Supreme Court. It's relatively new, but I imagine that none of you can name anyone who's on it, or maybe you can, maybe the Chief Justice or something. But in America, these justices have this sort of primacy that doesn't exist in other countries, and I think that that's partially due to the weirdness of the constitutional law system that they've set up for themselves, which is essentially that the Constitution is studied and plumbed for its hidden meanings, and those hidden meanings change over time. To my mind, I can't think of any other country that does it in this way. I personally think that everyone says that they want judicial restraint, but I think that once they're on the cusp of actually achieving what they like, then that goes out the window. I'm not sure how you square that circle. People have suggested some things like term limits and such, and short of actually packing the court. But I'm worried about the overall legitimacy of the court, because it is one of the few institutions that I think actually work relatively well. And by that, I mean, when you examine what Trump tried to do in terms of overturning the election, Republicans in Congress were more than willing to let him do that. Republican attorneys general were more than willing to let him do that. But every time he tried to bring his claims before the courts, because there's still a norm of decency and adherence to fact and law, 60 out of 61 courts, including some with Trump appointees, said, there's no basis here and leave. And had those claims, had any of them really gone to Supreme Court, I really have no doubt that the court would have turned him away. But as these sort of partisan wars continue, I think that they'll drag down the legitimacy of the court itself as well.
Yeah, sure. It's pretty shocking. The Democrats must be furious. They sort of worshipped her as a heroine at the time, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and her sort of really didn't step down until she died. Really, well, she didn't, and that she has, the blame has to lie with her to some degree, in terms of the Democratic camp.
Yeah, there's it's strange to me also that she became this. There's this neighborhood in Washington called Adams Morgan, and you'll see posters of her on the street lamps in Andy Warhol colors, which is just a slightly strange thing if you come to think about it. Someone who's interpreting the law, who's a sort of icon in this way. It doesn't seem like the sign of a healthiest democracy, but anyway.
Okay, we're going to rattle through these questions. More and more coming through. Let's take Hilary Matthews. Go ahead, Hilary. You're there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Just a comment about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I read in the New York Times a few months ago that she herself made a speech some time ago saying that she didn't think that the Roe v. Wade decision was watertight, and she was troubled that it might be upset at some point. I think she felt that it was open to being challenged, as it has been. But three very quick questions for you. One is, do you know if Mike Pence is going to testify at the January 6th hearings? And secondly, is the US ready for Pete Buttigieg, an openly gay person, to be president? Or in the case of Kamala Harris, a mixed race woman? Surely, given the climate now, neither one has much of a chance.
Let's deal with those last questions first.
Sure. I think a lot of the country would be okay with a gay president and a Black female president. But I think that the particular nature of the Electoral College makes it harder. I mean, I could see Pete Buttigieg winning the popular vote potentially. I think it's a little bit harder for Kamala to do that but that's just, I think, because of her inadequacies as a candidate. But in the places that you do need to win, state by state, you need to win a state like perhaps Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan. And in those states, you can imagine that those identity considerations, I think, would weigh negatively against them. And those are states that are decided by fairly tight margins anyway. And so for that reason, I think I think it might be uphill. I don't think it's impossible. But I think this country has made pretty good strides, particularly on acceptance of gay people. And then on your
Mike
first,
Pence testifying, yeah.
so I don't have any special knowledge. As far as I know, he's not planning to testify. I know that they asked one of the committee members who declined to comment, and I think that some people are getting excited. But my sense is that my guess would be that he won't.
Okay, Marcy Ryan, next, please.
Yes, hi. I'm in Connecticut, and your discussion so far has been at the federal level. And we have in this midterm election some very significant Secretary of State elections that could lead to tremendously increased voter suppression and even manipulation of voting results. So would you talk to that as well, please?
Sure. One thing that I've been looking at quite a lot has been the Secretary of State races. So I'm particularly concerned about the phenomenon of very hardcore Trump supporting candidates essentially trying to be the chief elections officers in states who will be responsible for certifying the 2024 presidential election. So the man that Brad Raffensperger was running against, Jody Heiss, was one such person. He was at the Capitol on January 6th, as was Mark Fincham, who is this candidate who's running to be the Arizona Secretary of State, and another person who is of similar ilk, has won the nomination to be Michigan's Secretary of State. I think Colorado also has nominated someone like this. I find that to be incredibly concerning, and I'm less concerned about. I should say I'm more concerned about the direct sort of electoral subversion and the chance that one of these people will not certify an election loss for Republicans, basically point blank, than I am about than I am about the voter suppression. I think Democrats have been actually focused on the wrong issue for the present times, and if you were to look at one of these secretaries of state and the position that they'd be in, I mean, you can imagine what would happen if Raffensperger had said, I'm not going to certify, or the Arizona result was not certified, the kind of constitutional crisis that this would trigger. We had a preview of this, I think, in New Mexico last week, where one of the counties, their commissioner basically refused to certify, saying that the voting machines had been tampered with, and a judge had to force them to do so. I'm worried that 2020 will look a bit like a dry run in comparison to what we might see in 2024, particularly if these people get elected, as they may well do, because it's going to be a grim year for Democrats in the midterms writ large.
Idrees, I have a few years back, I would sort of rebut people when people would say, Democrats, normally on the left, would say, American democracy in crisis, we've got fascism here. And I just dismiss it out of hand. But with January the 6th, the Trump's later days in the presidency, and what's happening now, one has to conform to that view. American democracy does seem to be in crisis, and it sets very bad precedents for the rest of the world. I look at the UK here. We're introducing laws that may make it more difficult for some people to register to vote. We've got a new Bill of Rights that makes it more difficult to demonstrate, for example. And these are among various pieces of legislation that are concerning. Can you give us a summary of American ills, and then possibly give us reasons to be hopeful?
Sure. One list might be longer than the other. So as far as the ills, I think that there's, one thing I didn't really appreciate until 2020 was how much the American system relied on norms of decency and shame. I realize it sounded a bit like my father, but when Ronald Reagan gave his inaugural address and said, a remarkable thing is happening here, I'm paraphrasing, but the peaceful transfer of power is something that has happened for roughly 200 years, and it's so commonplace in America that we never remark upon it. well, now it is remarkable. Now we do have reason to worry about it. In a way that's been broken. And the reason that the peaceful transfer of power happened was not really because the Electoral Count Act was watertight. It wasn't because officials were continuously being videotaped as they counted votes. It was because there was communal political trust, and there was a norm that if you lost the election fair and square, you said so. And that accounted for a lot of it. And what we see now is that once you get rid of that, the actual guardrails against someone trying to stay in office are quite thin. It's a few people. It's people like the Secretary of State in Georgia. It's people like those attorneys in the Department of Justice who said
it's
that
referred to here as the decent chap theory. In other words, of course, we'll play by the system and we'll be honorable men.
Yeah. And women, but what we see now is basically a decline, a huge sort of shock to that, and this idea. If you told me that more than half of Republican representatives in Congress would say, "Yeah, Trump should stay in office," a few months before the election, I would have thought you were crazy. That's, I think, one of the biggest, erosions. It's a sort of more profound loss, a more profound hindrance than, the mechanistic things that we can talk about, like the presence of the filibuster, or a sort of overly activist Supreme Court. Like I said earlier, I think the Supreme Court is still one of the few institutions in which you will find Republicans who say, if my guy loses, he shouldn't stay in office. That's somewhat of a controversial opinion within the Republican Party. And that's a huge problem.
Okay, I know you've got limited time, and so we've got two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So we have got Philip Godfrey. Yeah, you got your hand up, Philip. Go ahead, Philip.
Can you hear me, Nick?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to sound an optimistic note for once, which is unlike me, but maybe in handing down the issue of Roe and abortion to the states and letting, if you like, democracy play its part individually, state by state, that's going to be a threat to the less progressive caucus, because perhaps the voters will vote accordingly and will basically cause problems for the evangelical Christian right-wing minority that has basically placed.
But I think, Philip, what Idrees has been saying is that that issue, while it grabs the headlines, doesn't matter enough to the real fare that makes voters vote, which is, I suppose, essentially money in your pocket and the fact you back your side, right or wrong.
Yeah, I do take that point, but I still think it's going to be an interesting, if want of a better expression, experiment to see whether, given that the vast majority of Americans actually believe in some form of abortion rights, whether or not that will play out politically.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of these states, even the conservative ones, the abortion rules that have been put in place, complete bans before 6 weeks, which are effectively complete bans with limited exemptions. That is quite to the far right end of Americans' perspectives. A very small minority of Americans believe basically that abortion should be banned in all cases. Now, do I think that by itself is going to be enough to swing what looks like a pretty dismal year for Democrats? No, but unpopular policies tend to provoke backlashes, and I think that can take a few years to get through. I mean, witness Roe itself, right? That was the culmination of effectively a 40-year campaign to overturn something that a committed group of people found unpopular. So I expect there will be moderation, in part because these policies have all been designed in a hypothetical vacuum. These were all designed basically, when Roe goes, this is what we will have. and they haven't embraced the tough realities of life, which are that we're going to shortly get horror stories of young women, some of whom have been raped, being made to carry their babies to term, and that will, I think, change public opinion, and that I think will have an effect on the contours of these policies. But I think it might be more of a long-term effect than the short-term one that some people might be anticipating.
Okay.
There, we're going to wrap it up, everyone. I know Idrees is short on time, so my thanks to him. It's been, your analysis is brilliant, and you've got this ability to both provide us with the detail, but also give us a very good overview. I'm very grateful for your time, Idrees.
Okay, great. Well, I hope it was helpful. Thank you so much.